The Denver International Airport terminal buzzed with the energy of a Thursday morning. Marcus Webb stood in line at gate C-47, his boarding pass in hand, observing the symphony of human movement around him. People rushed, children cried, businessmen barked into phones, and families held hands with the kind of desperation reserved for airport terminals. Marcus, however, moved with the deliberate calm of someone who had spent 40 years in hospitals learning that panic solved nothing. At 63 years old, with silver threading through his dark hair and lines etched across his face that told stories of countless midnight emergencies, Marcus had earned the right to move slowly. 3 weeks ago, he'd handed his cardiac practice over to younger doctors. The retirement party had felt like a funeral, colleagues shaking his hand as if saying goodbye to someone already departed. His wife Sarah had encouraged the change. "Enjoy life," she'd said, kissing his forehead. "You've earned it." But Marcus felt untethered, like a ship without an anchor. This trip to Phoenix was meant to be therapeutic. His old friend Daniel lived there now, retired from law enforcement, running a small consulting business. They hadn't seen each other in 5 years. Daniel had called, insisting Marcus visit, spent a few days hiking in the Arizona heat, clearing his mind of the ghosts that haunted his retirement. The boarding agent announced pre-boarding for families and first-class passengers. Marcus remained seated, watching. This was his favorite airport observation game, guessing who would cause problems, who would be overjoyed, who would try to sneak extra bags. A young mother struggled with 3 children under 5. Marcus smiled, remembering when he and Sarah had thought having 2 kids was chaos. An elderly couple held hands as if afraid one might disappear. A businessman checked his watch 17 times in 30 seconds, his leg bouncing with anxiety. When they called his row, Marcus stood, gathered his modest carry-on, just a week's worth of clothes and his reading glasses, and moved toward the jet bridge. The airport corridor smelled like coffee and recycled air, a scent so distinctly contemporary it almost seemed antiseptic. He'd always found airports oddly peaceful, despite their frenetic energy. They existed outside normal time, in a space where humanity was temporarily suspended between destinations. Southwest Airlines Flight 1247 waited like a silver bird on the tarmac. Marcus climbed the stairs, nodded at the flight attendant, and made his way down the narrow aisle. He'd chosen seat 14A specifically, an aisle seat in the middle of the plane, far enough back to observe everything, far enough forward to feel relatively safe. He'd learned this preference through decades of business travel before his practice consumed his life. The aircraft was filling rapidly. A family with a toddler took the seats behind him. A businessman settled into 14B, immediately opening his laptop. A woman in 14C clutched her phone, texting furiously. Everyone absorbed in their own worlds, their own dramas, their own destinations. Marcus stowed his carry-on, settled into his seat, and pulled out the mystery novel he'd started 3 days ago. It was a first edition John Grisham, something he'd never had time for during his career. Retirement gift to himself. But he found it difficult to concentrate. His mind kept wandering back to the hospital, to the cardiac unit, to the faces of patients he'd never see again. The captain emerged from the cockpit at approximately 8:05 a.m. Marcus noticed him immediately because observation was his nature, his profession, his curse. Captain James Richardson, according to the nameplate on his uniform, was in his mid-60s, with the bearing of someone who'd spent decades commanding aircraft. He wore his uniform like a second skin, pressed, immaculate, every button perfectly aligned. His silver hair was military short, and his smile had the practiced warmth of someone trained in customer service. But as Marcus watched, really watched, the way only a physician trained to observe could, something seemed off. Richardson moved through the cabin greeting passengers, stopping to ask a child's name, making pleasant small talk with business travelers. Standard captain protocol, but his movements seemed labored. His left leg dragged almost imperceptibly with each step. His smile, while genuine, seemed to require more effort than it should. Marcus's medical instincts, dormant for 3 weeks, suddenly awakened like a sleeping predator. He recognized that particular hesitation in the captain's gait. He'd seen it before in patients, that subtle compensation for something wrong. The slight tightness around the eyes. The way Richardson adjusted his collar once, then again, as if it felt too tight. The captain noticed a child pointing at him and bent down to high-five the girl, and for just a moment Marcus saw the captain's jaw tighten. Not pain exactly, but discomfort. Something wasn't right. Richardson continued forward, disappearing into the cockpit. Marcus found himself staring at the closed door, his mind running through possibilities. He was retired now. Whatever was happening with the captain was no longer his concern. He'd spent 40 years being on call, responsible, the person everyone turned to. He'd earned the right to look away. But he couldn't. Marcus pulled out his phone and checked the time, 8:09 a.m. He looked at his book, tried to read a paragraph, understood nothing. His attention remained locked on the cockpit door. Around him, other passengers continued their routines, oblivious. The businessman typed. The mother sang softly to her toddler. The woman in 14C resumed texting. Only Marcus sat in suspended awareness, that particular state of heightened alertness he thought he'd left behind in the hospital. His fingers drummed against the armrest. His breathing, trained over decades to remain calm, stayed measured and slow. But internally, every nerve ending transmitted a signal he recognized intimately. Something was wrong. The pre-flight announcements began, the flight attendant's voice smooth and practiced. Marcus listened to the emergency procedures he could recite in his sleep after 4 decades of flying. The oxygen masks descended visibly. The brace position was demonstrated. The exits were pointed out. Everything was routine. Everything was normal. But in the cockpit, Captain James Richardson sat in his chair, gripping the armrest slightly harder than usual, wondering if he should report the strange pressure he'd felt in his chest since this morning, wondering if it was just indigestion, wondering if he should tell someone. He decided not to. Just a few more hours until retirement, just a few more flights. And in seat 14A, Marcus Webb waited, watching, not yet knowing that destiny was about to rewrite both their futures in ways neither could possibly imagine. The aircraft climbed steadily into Colorado's brilliant blue sky, banking gently westward. Marcus had dozed off for approximately 45 minutes, his head resting against the small pillow the flight attendant had provided. When he woke, they were already well into the flight, the landscape below transformed into a patchwork quilt of browns and greens. The businessman in 14B was asleep, his laptop closed. The mother behind him was entertaining her toddler with a coloring book. Everything felt normal, routine, the familiar rhythm of commercial air travel. Marcus checked his watch. 10:47 a.m., roughly 2 hours into the 3-hour flight. The cabin temperature was set to that peculiar cool that airline companies insisted upon, making everyone slightly uncomfortable but not enough to complain. The hum of the engines provided a white noise that was simultaneously soothing and unsettling, a reminder that they were suspended over the earth, held aloft by nothing but physics and faith. He just returned to his book, retracing the plot threads he'd lost during his sleep when the intercom crackled. The sound was routine, expected. Every commercial flight followed the same script. Someone would announce something about weather, altitude, or a point of interest below. Marcus had heard these announcements thousands of times. They were the soundtrack of his business travel years, as familiar as his own heartbeat. But this particular crackle carried an edge. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain James Richardson speaking from the cockpit." The voice filled the cabin, projecting through overhead speakers with a tone designed to convey authority and calm. "We're currently maintaining an altitude of 35,000 feet, cruising at 520 miles per hour. Beautiful day ahead of us." Marcus lowered his book. Something in those words bothered him. His eyes narrowed, his physician's brain already working, already analyzing. He replayed the sentence in his mind, "Beautiful day ahead of us." The phrasing was normal. The content was standard, but the delivery. There was a slight slur, not dramatic, not obvious, but present. Marcus had spent 40 years listening to people speak. He'd learned to hear the things they weren't saying, to detect the physical manifestations of internal disease. He diagnosed diabetic episodes from the way patients' words slightly slurred. He'd identified strokes from subtle changes in speech patterns. He'd caught cancer patients' whispered pain in the hesitation of their sentences. His ear was finely tuned to the orchestra of human distress. And right now, that ear was detecting an anomaly. "We'll be pointing out some landmarks as we approach Arizona," the captain continued. "If you look out the right side of the aircraft, you'll see the San Juan Mountains in just a few minutes. Quite spectacular this time of year." There it was again, a barely perceptible thickness in the word spectacular. Not quite a slur, but something. A heaviness to the syllables, as if the captain's tongue was slightly thicker than it should be, or his lips not quite as responsive as normal. Marcus's book lay forgotten in his lap. Every instinct screamed at him to stand up, walk to the cockpit, assess the captain. But he was retired. He had no authority here. He had no responsibility. He had signed away his obligation to medicine 3 weeks ago when he'd handed over his practice. Hadn't he? The captain's voice returned. "We're expecting clear skies all the way to Phoenix. Should be touching down on time at approximately 1 o'clock. Thank you for flying Southwest, and we appreciate your business." The intercom clicked off. For a moment the cabin held its breath, then returned to normal. The businessman checked his email. The mother wiped a child's nose. A flight attendant began the beverage service, pushing a cart down the narrow aisle. But Marcus sat motionless, his mind running through a diagnostic checklist he thought he'd retired. He pulled out his phone and navigated to the flight information app, checking Captain Richardson's name and credentials. There, a profile photo. The same man he'd observed in the terminal, the same military-precise bearing, the same silver hair. According to the airline's records, Richardson had been flying for 37 years. An exemplary record. No incidents, no complaints, a decorated captain. So why did his voice contain that subtle irregularity? Marcus considered possibilities. Allergies, possible, but the slurring wasn't consistent with typical allergy symptoms. A cold, maybe, but again the pattern was wrong. Alcohol at 10 in the morning. Unlikely for a commercial pilot, especially one with Richardson's record. Medication, possible. Some cardiac medications could cause this. Some neurological medications. Some psychological medications. The beverage cart reached 14A. The flight attendant, a woman named Sarah according to her name tag, smiled down at him. "What can I get you today?" "Water, please," Marcus said, then impulsively added, "How's the captain doing?" He seemed a bit under the weather on the announcement. Sarah's smile didn't waver. "The captain, oh, he seemed fine to me. Why, did you notice something?" Marcus hesitated. He didn't want to be that passenger, the one who caused unnecessary concern, who saw problems where none existed. He was retired. He was supposed to be relaxing, enjoying his freedom, not diagnosing aircraft captains from seat 14A. "No, nothing," he said, accepting the water bottle. "Just seemed like he might be fighting something. Cold season, you know." "Oh, definitely," Sarah agreed. "My whole family's been sick, but Captain Richardson's been flying for decades. If anyone knows how to work through a rough day, it's him." She moved on and Marcus sat back, sipping his water, his mind still engaged in the problem. The rational part of his brain, the retired part, the part that wanted to enjoy this trip, insisted he was overreacting. A slight irregularity in speech patterns meant nothing. Thousands of explanations existed, most of them completely benign. But the other part of his brain, the physician part, the healer part, the part that had spent 40 years listening to bodies betray their owners, continued signaling warnings. He looked out the window at the landscape passing beneath them. The San Juan Mountains were indeed visible, their peaks catching afternoon light with majestic indifference to the small concerns of a retired cardiologist on a commercial flight. Marcus forced himself back to his book. He read the same paragraph 3 times without comprehension. Around him, the flight continued its routine rhythms. A child laughed. An elderly couple shared earbuds watching a movie. A businessman worked on a spreadsheet. The flight attendants delivered drinks and snacks. Everything was normal. And yet in the cockpit, Captain James Richardson sat in his seat, his hands steady on the yoke despite the strange sensation creeping across his chest. He'd felt it intermittently for the past hour. A tightness, a pressure, nothing unbearable but definitely present. He'd experienced indigestion before, dozens of times. This felt different but not dramatically so. Not enough to declare an emergency. Not enough to interrupt the flight. Just enough to worry him, although he wouldn't admit it. Back in seat 14A, Marcus Webb stared unseeing at his book, waiting. He didn't know for what. But every fiber of his being, every lesson learned through 40 years of medical practice, told him something was beginning. Something was unfolding at 35,000 feet. Something that would require a retired cardiologist to remember exactly why he dedicated his life to saving people. It happened without warning. One moment, the cabin existed in its comfortable routine. The next moment, the world transformed into chaos. The aircraft lurched violently to the right. Not a slight adjustment, not a gentle banking maneuver. A sharp, unexpected movement that sent drinks flying, overhead bins opening, and a collective gasp erupting from every passenger simultaneously. Marcus's book tumbled from his lap. The businessman's laptop crashed to the floor. The mother behind him clutched her child, her scream barely audible beneath the roar of alarmed voices. The altitude, previously steady at 35,000 feet, began to fluctuate erratically. The aircraft's nose tilted downward at an angle that felt completely wrong. Marcus's stomach lurched, that particular sensation of weightlessness that accompanied sudden descent. His training kicked in immediately, overriding the initial shock. Decompression. No, he could breathe normally. Engine failure. The engines continued their familiar roar, though something about their pitch seemed off balance. The aircraft was descending, but unevenly struggling. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain calm." A voice came through the intercom, but it wasn't Captain Richardson. This voice was younger, higher-pitched, definitely stressed despite the attempt at professional composure. "We're experiencing some technical difficulty. Please return to your seats and fasten your seatbelts immediately." Technical difficulty. The euphemism felt like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples of fear through the cabin. Every passenger understood what technical difficulty meant at 30,000 feet. It meant something had gone very wrong. The aircraft straightened slightly, though the descent continued. Through the window, Marcus could see the landscape below much closer than it should be. Mountains and valleys that moments ago had seemed safely distant were now becoming disturbingly distinct. His mind calculated angles and descent rates with the precision of someone trained in physics and medicine both. They were dropping roughly 1,000 feet per minute. At this rate, they had perhaps 15 minutes before the aircraft reached dangerously low altitude. Panic erupted throughout the cabin. A woman 3 rows back screamed. Someone prayed loudly in Spanish. The businessman jumped from his seat, hitting the overhead bin. The mother held her child so tightly the little girl began crying in confused terror. "Everyone sit down," one of the flight attendants shouted, her voice cracking with barely controlled panic. "Return to your seats immediately." But people weren't sitting. They were standing, pointing toward the cockpit, asking if anyone knew what was happening. A man in first class unbuckled his seatbelt, insisting he needed to do something. The blonde woman across the aisle from Marcus gripped his arm, her fingernails digging into his skin. "What's happening? What's happening?" she repeated like a mantra. "We don't know yet," Marcus said quietly, gently removing her hand from his arm. His voice carried the exact calm that came from 40 years of crisis management. Right now, the safest thing is to remain in your seat. The pilots know what they're doing. But did they? That was the question nobody wanted to ask. The captain had been struggling with something before the flight reached cruising altitude. And now the aircraft was descending uncontrollably, and a younger voice was coming through the intercom, a voice that sounded utterly terrified. "This is your co-pilot," the strained voice continued. "We're declaring a medical emergency. Captain Richardson has become incapacitated. We are beginning an emergency descent toward the nearest airport. Please remain calm and seated. Flight attendants, prepare for possible emergency procedures." The words hung in the cabin like a death knell. Medical emergency in the cockpit. The captain, incapacitated. The aircraft was now being piloted by a single person, and from the sound of his voice, that person was barely holding it together. Marcus's entire body went rigid. Every nerve ending activated simultaneously. A medical emergency in the cockpit. This was exactly what he'd sensed, exactly what those subtle warnings in the captain's speech pattern had been screaming. The chest pain, the slurred words, the subtle physical compensation. It had been building all along. And now the captain was unconscious, or worse. A flight attendant, not Sarah, but a younger man named Derek, appeared in the cabin, his face ashen. He gripped the armrest to steady himself against the aircraft's irregular movement. "Is there a doctor on board?" he called out, his voice cutting through the noise like a knife. "We need a doctor. Is there a medical professional on this flight?" Every eye turned toward Derek. Passengers looked at each other, uncertainty and fear mingling in their expressions. Someone pointed at an older gentleman in first class. Derek rushed toward him, but the man shook his head. "I'm retired," he said helplessly. "I haven't practiced in." "I'm a cardiologist," Marcus called out, unbuckling his seatbelt. "Retired, but I'm trained." Derek's face transformed into something resembling hope. "We need you in the cockpit, now." Marcus stood, steady despite the aircraft's uneven movements. Around him, passengers watched with the desperate eyes of people clinging to a rope they weren't sure would hold. The businessman grabbed his wrist. "You can fix this, right? You can save us." Marcus didn't answer. There was no answer that would help. He simply pulled his wrist free and moved toward the cockpit, using the seats for balance as the aircraft continued its irregular descent. The cabin door was already open. Derek blocked the entrance, looking frantic. "Captain collapsed about 5 minutes ago," he said rapidly. "Co-pilot Tom Chen is flying. The captain just suddenly went rigid, then went completely limp. We got him on the floor, checked his pulse. It's there, but it's weak. We don't know what happened." Marcus pushed past him, entering the cockpit. The space was cramped, designed for 2 pilots and only 2 pilots. Captain Richardson lay sprawled on the narrow floor space between the seats, his uniform disheveled, his face a concerning shade of gray-blue. His eyes were closed. His breathing, if you could call it that, was shallow and irregular. Tom Chen sat rigidly in the captain's seat, his hands gripping the control yoke with white-knuckled intensity, his eyes fixed on the instruments before him. "He just collapsed," Tom said without turning around. "1 second we were discussing the descent, the next he just went. I've radioed Phoenix. They're preparing emergency landing procedures, but I need to know if he's alive. I need to know if he's—" "I'm here," Marcus said, already kneeling beside Richardson. His fingers found the carotid artery. The pulse was there, but it was thready and rapid. Too rapid. Arrhythmia, cardiac event. Everything his training had warned him about was manifesting before him. Through the cockpit windshield, Marcus could see Arizona sprawling below them, getting larger with each passing second. They were maybe 10,000 feet now, descending rapidly toward Phoenix Sky Harbor, toward emergency crews, toward help. But Captain James Richardson was dying, and Marcus had to make a choice. Begin emergency procedures in a cramped cockpit while an aircraft descended unevenly, or let the captain slip away. The decision made itself. "Get me the defibrillator," Marcus commanded. "And someone call the hospital. Tell them we have a cardiac patient in critical condition inbound to Phoenix Sky Harbor. Time is everything." Cockpit felt impossibly small. Marcus knelt beside Captain Richardson, his fingers still on the carotid artery, counting the erratic beats. 120, 130, way too fast. The captain's skin was cold and clammy despite the warm cockpit environment. His breathing had become even shallower, almost absent. Every sign screamed acute cardiac event. "Derek," Marcus called over his shoulder, "I need that defibrillator, now. And I need someone to get me towels, ice if you have it, and anything resembling a medical kit from the first aid box." Tom Chen remained motionless in the captain's seat, his voice steady but strained as he spoke to air traffic control. "Phoenix Sky Harbor, Southwest 1247. We have a medical emergency in the cockpit. Captain James Richardson is unresponsive. We're beginning emergency descent. Current altitude 32,000 feet. Requesting immediate emergency landing clearance." The response came back crisp and professional. "Southwest 1247, Phoenix Sky Harbor. We copy your medical emergency. We're clearing the runway. Emergency crews are being mobilized. What is the nature of the medical emergency?" "Cardiac event," Tom said, glancing back at Marcus with desperate eyes. "We have a physician on board assisting. Current patient status unknown. We're descending at a rapid rate toward your facility." Marcus examined Richardson's chest, pulling open the captain's uniform shirt, revealing the pale, middle-aged chest beneath. The captain's sternum rose and fell in shallow, inadequate movements. Marcus placed his ear against Richardson's ribs, listening for heartbeat sounds. What he heard terrified him, an irregular, fluttering chaos instead of a steady rhythm. Atrial fibrillation, maybe worse. The captain's heart wasn't beating in any organized pattern. It was essentially quivering, unable to pump blood effectively. Without intervention within minutes, the captain's brain would begin dying from lack of oxygen. Within minutes after that, the damage would become irreversible. Derek reappeared, breathless, clutching the aircraft's emergency medical kit. It was basic, the kind found on commercial aircraft, designed for minor emergencies and severe injuries, not sophisticated enough for complex cardiac intervention. But it was something. "How long until Phoenix?" Marcus asked Tom, already opening the medical kit. 11 minutes, Tom said. His knuckles were white on the control yoke as the aircraft continued its irregular descent. "Maybe 10 if I push it." "We might not have 10 minutes, Marcus said quietly. He found the defibrillator, a basic automated external defibrillator, the same model he'd seen in hundreds of airports and public buildings. It would have to work. It had to work. "Come on, James," Marcus whispered to the unconscious captain, his mind suddenly flooded with memories. He'd never met Captain Richardson before this flight, but in the past 3 weeks, Marcus had thought about what it meant to lose purpose, what it meant to step away from something you dedicated your life to. Richardson had flown for 37 years. And now, at the end of his career, possibly at the end of his life, Marcus was going to fight like hell to keep him alive. The defibrillator's voice came through mechanical and calm as Marcus turned it on, analyzing heart rhythm. "Do not touch the patient." The aircraft banked gently, and Marcus steadied himself against the armrest. They were descending faster now, the landscape visible through the cockpit windows growing rapidly larger. Desert mountains and valleys that had seemed abstract from cruise altitude were now becoming disturbingly three-dimensional and real. "Come on," Marcus muttered, keeping his fingers on Richardson's neck, monitoring the impossible rhythm. Still fibrillating, still chaos. The captain's face was becoming more gray, more lifeless. Hypoxia was already setting in. Brain cells were already dying. "Shock advised," the defibrillator announced. "Stand clear." Marcus placed the pads precisely where training had taught him decades ago, one below the right collarbone, one at the left ribcage. The machine charged with a high-pitched whine. "Shocking now," it said. "Stand clear." Richardson's body convulsed as electricity surged through him, every muscle going rigid simultaneously. It was violent and terrible and necessary. Marcus checked the neck pulse again, praying for that familiar steady beat. Nothing, still fibrillating. "Resume CPR," the machine commanded. Marcus didn't hesitate. He positioned his hands on Richardson's sternum, centered his weight, and began compressions. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Hard and fast. 30 compressions, then 2 rescue breaths. No time for hesitation. No time for doubt. Every second mattered. "Phoenix Tower, Southwest 1247, Tom's voice cut through Marcus's concentration. 12 minutes to landing. Patient in cardiac arrest. Physician on board performing CPR. Request immediate emergency response." "Copy 1247. We're ready. Paramedics standing by. Continue your approach." Marcus performed another cycle of compressions. His 63-year-old muscles screamed in protest, but he ignored them. His hands were strong, trained, precise. 40 years of medical practice had taught his body the exact amount of pressure needed, hard enough to circulate blood, not so hard as to break ribs. Though at this moment, Marcus would have broken every rib in Richardson's chest if it meant keeping him alive. "Come on, James," Marcus whispered between breaths. "Come on, you made it 37 years, don't give up now." The aircraft continued its descent. Through the cockpit window, Phoenix was now clearly visible, the sprawl of the city, the mountains beyond, the desert stretching endlessly. And somewhere down there, paramedics were preparing. Helicopters were standing by. Hospital beds were being readied. But right here, in this cramped cockpit, it was just Marcus and a dying captain and the desperate hope that training and will could overcome biology. Derek appeared in the doorway again. "How much longer?" he asked helplessly. 8 minutes, Tom said, "maybe less." 8 minutes, 800 seconds, 8,000 heartbeats, except Richardson's heart wasn't beating properly. Wasn't beating at all, really. Just fibrillating, quivering, dying. Marcus checked for a pulse again. Still nothing. He began another cycle of compressions, his rhythm perfect, his movements precise. The defibrillator was ready. As soon as they reached lower altitude, they could try again. Defibrillation worked better at certain altitudes. Every variable mattered. "Stay with me," Marcus said to the unconscious captain, though Richardson couldn't hear him. "Stay with me. Your crew needs you. Your wife needs you. This flight needs you." Through the cockpit windows, Phoenix Sky Harbor came into view, runways extending like welcoming arms, emergency vehicles already positioned, lights flashing urgently in the desert sun. They were almost there, almost to help, almost to the hospital where sophisticated equipment and surgical teams waited. But first, Marcus had to keep Captain James Richardson alive. His hands never stopped moving. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Marcus's hands moved with mechanical precision, years of training overriding the burning in his shoulders and chest. 30 compressions. Then 2 rescue breaths. 30 compressions. 2 breaths. The rhythm was everything. Miss the rhythm and the captain's brain cells died faster. Miss the rhythm and they were merely going through motions that amounted to nothing. Richardson's chest depressed beneath his palms, the ribs providing resistance that told Marcus he was applying the correct pressure. Not too soft, wouldn't circulate blood effectively. Not too hard, would fracture ribs and damage internal organs. This particular balance between saving and harming was a line Marcus had walked for 40 years. His body remembered. His muscle memory was perfect. But exhaustion was already setting in. Marcus was 63 years old. He'd spent the past 3 weeks retired, sleeping later, exercising less, living a gentler life. Now his heart was pounding, his muscles screaming, his lungs demanding oxygen. Sweat dripped from his temples, stinging his eyes. The cockpit was warm, too warm. The aircraft's environmental system wasn't designed for intense physical exertion. "Shock advised," the defibrillator announced. "Stand clear." Marcus removed his hands, stepping back as the machine charged again. The high-pitched whine built to a crescendo, then the electrical current surged through Richardson's body. The captain convulsed, a horrible, involuntary movement that looked far too much like death. "Checking rhythm," the machine said calmly. Marcus held his breath. Come on, please come back, please organize yourself, please start pumping blood like you're supposed to." "No shock advised, resume CPR." Marcus's heart sank, still fibrillating, still chaos. They were running out of time and running out of miracles simultaneously. He dropped to his knees again, positioning his hands, beginning another cycle of compressions. Through the cockpit windows, Phoenix was growing larger. The airport sprawled before them, but they were still thousands of feet in the air, still minutes away, minutes that Richardson's brain couldn't afford to lose. "How long?" Marcus called to Tom Chin, not breaking rhythm. 5 minutes, Tom said, his voice tight with tension. "Maybe 4. I'm pushing the descent as hard as I safely can." 4 minutes, 240 seconds, 240 heartbeats that Richardson's body needed Marcus's hands to provide. "Phoenix Tower, 1247, Tom continued, his hands steady on the control yoke despite the desperation of the situation. "Patient remains in cardiac arrest. Physician continuing CPR. ETA 4 minutes. "Copy 1247. Paramedics are standing by. Trauma team is being notified. You're cleared for emergency landing on runway 8 left. Reduce altitude to 15,000 feet." The aircraft banked and Marcus adjusted his position, his hands never pausing, never hesitating. The physical reality of what he was doing suddenly crystallized. He was keeping James Richardson alive through pure force of will and mechanical repetition. Without his hands, without his breaths, the captain was already dead. The captain's heart had stopped being functional. His lungs had stopped breathing on their own. Everything that made Richardson alive, that was coming from Marcus right now. The responsibility was suffocating. "Come on, James," Marcus whispered between breaths, his voice rough and desperate. "Come on, I know you're tired, I know it's been a long career, but you've got to fight. You've got to fight with me." Marcus had never met this man before this morning, had never spoken to him, had never known his hopes or dreams or what his wife's name was or how many grandchildren might be waiting for him somewhere below. But right now, Captain James Richardson was the most important person in the universe. Right now, on this aircraft descending toward Phoenix, nothing else mattered except keeping this man's brain alive until medical professionals could take over. Another cycle, and another. The compressions continued with metronomic regularity. Marcus's shoulders burned, his hands cramped. His back protested the awkward kneeling position. He ignored everything. Pain was irrelevant, discomfort was irrelevant, exhaustion would have to wait. "Shock advised," the defibrillator announced again. "Stand clear." For a moment hope surged. If the machine was advising a shock, it meant the heart rhythm had changed from one kind of abnormal to another kind of abnormal, maybe a shockable rhythm, maybe a chance. The electricity surged through Richardson's body again, the convulsion, the waiting. "Analyzing rhythm," the machine said. The seconds felt like hours. "Weak normal rhythm detected. Pulse check recommended." Marcus pressed his fingers to Richardson's carotid artery. For a moment, just for a moment, he felt something. A pulse. Weak, definitely abnormal, but present. Actual pumping. The captain's heart was working again. "We've got a pulse," Marcus called out, relief flooding through him like a breaking dam. "We've got a pulse." "Thank God," Tom said, his voice breaking slightly. "Phoenix, we have a pulse. Patient has regained cardiac rhythm." Through the windows, the Phoenix airport was filling most of the view now. They were low enough that individual vehicles were visible. Emergency lights flashed red and blue against the desert landscape. Everything was ready. Everything was waiting. But the pulse was weak. Marcus could feel it, irregular, insufficient, a heart that was barely functioning. Richardson could arrest again at any moment. The battle wasn't won. It was merely suspended. The real fight would happen at the hospital, in operating rooms with surgical teams and sophisticated equipment. Marcus's hands moved to Richardson's carotid artery, checking the pulse every few seconds, terrified it would disappear again. The captain's skin was still cold and gray. His eyes remained closed. His breathing was still absent, completely dependent on Marcus's rescue breaths. 2 minutes, Tom announced, maybe less. 2 minutes, 120 seconds. Marcus could see the runway now extending ahead of them like a promise, like salvation, like a finish line that was finally coming into view. "Come on, James," Marcus whispered, performing another rescue breath, watching the captain's chest rise as air filled his lungs. "Come on, we're almost there. We're almost home." The aircraft descended lower. 500 feet. 300 feet. Marcus could see individual emergency vehicles now, could see people standing ready, could see the apparatus of modern medicine prepared to take over what his hands and will had started. "Touchdown in 60 seconds, Tom said. The wheels came down. The landing gear extended with a mechanical shudder. The airport environment grew larger, more real, more immediate. This was happening. This was actually happening. Marcus kept his fingers on Richardson's carotid artery, monitoring that precious, fragile pulse. Weak, irregular, but present. "Come on, James," Marcus said one more time, more prayer than statement. "Come on." The aircraft touched down. The wheels touched the tarmac with controlled precision. Tom Chen's landing was textbook perfect, smooth, even professional. The kind of landing that only decades of training could produce under circumstances that would have broken lesser pilots. The aircraft slowed as reverse thrust engaged, the runway blurring beneath them as they decelerated rapidly. Marcus kept his hands on Richardson's carotid artery, monitoring that precious, fragile pulse. Still present, still weak. Still his responsibility. "Wheels down," Tom announced, his voice steady despite everything. "Good landing, paramedics are rolling." Through the cockpit windows, Marcus could see them, emergency vehicles converging on their position like white blood cells responding to infection. Fire trucks, ambulances, rescue equipment, all converging on Southwest Flight 1247, all here for Captain James Richardson. The aircraft came to a complete stop. For a moment, everything fell silent except for the whine of the engine spooling down. That brief moment of quiet felt surreal, as if the universe was holding its breath. Then chaos erupted. The cockpit door was yanked open. A paramedic in a dark blue uniform appeared, followed immediately by 2 more, all carrying equipment bags, all moving with the organized urgency of trained professionals who'd seen this movie before. "Cardiac arrest?" the lead paramedic asked, dropping to his knees beside Marcus and Richardson. "Massive cardiac event," Marcus said rapidly, his voice hoarse from performing rescue breaths. "Likely myocardial infarction. He went into ventricular fibrillation approximately 15 minutes ago at 35,000 feet. I've performed CPR for roughly 10 minutes. Got return of spontaneous circulation about 2 minutes ago. Current pulse is weak, irregular, approximately 60 beats per minute." The paramedic, his name tag read Rodriguez, assessed Richardson in seconds with the efficiency of someone who'd been doing this for decades. His hands moved with practiced precision, checking pupils, listening to lungs, palpating the abdomen. His 2 partners set up equipment with mechanical efficiency. "Good work," Rodriguez said to Marcus, and those 2 words felt like a benediction. "You kept him alive." But Marcus's hands were still on Richardson's carotid artery. The pulse was slowing, not disappearing, still there, still present, but definitely slowing. The captain's color was becoming more gray, more wrong. "Pulse is weakening," Marcus said urgently. "I think he's going into shock." "We've got him," Rodriguez said, already positioning oxygen over Richardson's face. Another paramedic was establishing an IV line, his hands moving with such speed and precision it seemed like magic. A third was attaching cardiac monitoring equipment, electrodes finding their way onto Richardson's bare chest. The cardiac monitor sprang to life, its screen showing the erratic, chaotic rhythm of a heart struggling to function. The paramedics exchanged looks, the kind of wordless communication that came from years of working together. Rodriguez was already on the radio. "Phoenix Memorial Trauma Center, this is Paramedic 1. We have a male, approximately 65 years old, presenting with acute cardiac event. In cardiac arrest in the field for approximately 15 minutes. Return of spontaneous circulation achieved by civilian physician. Current vital signs: pulse weak and irregular at approximately 60 beats per minute, respirations shallow at 8 per minute, blood pressure barely palpable. Patient is completely unresponsive. ETA to facility approximately 4 minutes. The response crackled back. "Copy, Paramedic 1, trauma team standing by. Activate cardiac catheterization lab, we're ready." Marcus finally stood, his legs nearly buckling beneath him. He hadn't realized how much of his weight he'd been putting on the captain's chest. His entire body was trembling, adrenaline letdown combined with pure exhaustion. He stumbled backward, gripping the armrest to steady himself. Through the cockpit door he could see into the cabin. Every passenger was staring toward the cockpit, their faces pale, their eyes wide. Some were crying, some were praying, some were simply sitting in stunned silence trying to process the fact that they'd survived, that the aircraft hadn't crashed, that despite the chaos and terror they were alive. A flight attendant appeared in the doorway. Will he? "We're taking him to the hospital," Rodriguez said, already preparing Richardson for transport. The paramedics had converted the captain into a patient, a body to be managed and moved. They placed him on a stretcher with the practiced efficiency of people who'd done this thousands of times. IVs dangled. Oxygen continued. The cardiac monitor was secured. "Let's move," Rodriguez commanded. "Time is critical." The paramedics wheeled Richardson toward the cabin door with single-minded purpose. The stretcher banged slightly against the narrow cockpit opening, a moment of physical reality crashing against the constraints of aircraft design. But they maneuvered through, and suddenly the captain was gone, spirited away by professionals with equipment and knowledge and hospital resources that Marcus no longer had. The weight of the moment struck Marcus then. He'd done everything he could. He'd performed CPR. He'd used the defibrillator. He'd kept Richardson alive through sheer force of will and 40 years of medical training. But now, the outcome was beyond his control. Now it was in the hands of surgeons and cardiologists and hospital equipment. Now it was in the hands of chance and biology and whatever gods watched over such things. Marcus staggered into the cabin and immediately had to grip a seat for balance. His legs felt like they'd forgotten how to work. His vision swam slightly. The adrenaline that had sustained him was disappearing, leaving behind exhaustion so profound it felt like drowning in slow motion. A passenger, the businessman who'd sat in 14B, stood up. Then another. Then another. Within seconds the entire cabin was standing and applause erupted. Not angry applause, not polite applause, desperate, grateful, tearful applause. The sound of people who'd been given back their lives, who'd watched death arrive and then watched someone stand between them and oblivion. An elderly woman grabbed Marcus's arm. "Thank you," she said simply, tears streaming down her face. "Thank you for saving us." But had he saved Captain Richardson, or merely delayed the inevitable? The captain was alive, yes, but cardiac events like the one Richardson had experienced were often fatal. Even with the best hospital care, even with the fastest intervention, many patients didn't survive the initial event or its complications. Tom Chen emerged from the cockpit, his face ashen. When he saw Marcus, something broke in his expression. He walked over and without a word embraced him. "Thank you," Tom said, his voice breaking. I didn't know what to do, but you saved him. You saved all of us." Through the windows, Marcus could see the ambulance racing away from the aircraft, its lights flashing, heading toward Phoenix Memorial Trauma Center at speeds that exceeded safety guidelines. Somewhere in that ambulance, Captain James Richardson was either fighting to survive or beginning his final journey. Marcus had no way of knowing which. A flight attendant brought him water, then a chair. "You should sit," she said gently. "You've been through something extraordinary." Marcus sat, the water bottle trembling in his hands. Outside, the Arizona sun beat down on the aircraft. Refueling trucks were already moving into position. Ground crews were assessing the aircraft for damage. The machinery of commercial air travel continued its relentless operations. But Marcus sat in seat 14A, the same seat where he'd spent the morning journey, and wondered if Captain Richardson would live. Wondered if the next message he received would be one of gratitude or one of loss. Wondered if his retirement had just ended, or if the most important part of his career was still unfolding. The applause started quietly, then built into something almost overwhelming. Marcus wanted to say it wasn't for him, that these people were applauding the paramedics, the co-pilot, the flight attendants, the anonymous heroes scattered throughout the aircraft who'd kept calm while others panicked. But he knew the truth. They were applauding him. They were applauding the moment a stranger stood up and said, "I'm a doctor," and meant it. They were applauding the fact that they were alive. A woman in first class was weeping openly. Not tears of fear anymore, but tears of gratitude and relief. An elderly man held his wife's hand, both of them staring toward the cockpit where Marcus had just emerged. A young mother clutched her child, kissing the top of her head repeatedly, as if confirming the child's existence, her safety, her reality. Derek, the young flight attendant, approached Marcus with red-rimmed eyes. "Can I get you something? Water, juice, anything." "Water," Marcus said hoarsely. His throat felt like sandpaper. His voice sounded like it belonged to someone else, someone older, more broken, more aware of mortality. Derek disappeared, and Marcus made his way back to seat 14A. The businessman who'd occupied 14B was standing, unable to sit despite the aircraft being stationary on the tarmac. The woman in 14C was on her phone, telling someone, her husband probably, that she was okay, that the situation had been resolved, that a doctor had saved everyone. Had he saved everyone? That question looped through Marcus's mind as he collapsed into his seat. He'd saved the aircraft from crashing. He'd given Captain Richardson a chance at survival, but survival and recovery were different things. Survival meant the captain reached the hospital. Recovery meant he came home, returned to his wife, got to live out whatever years remained to him. Marcus had only managed half of that equation. His hands were still trembling. He held them up, studying them with detached curiosity. These hands that had spent 40 years healing people, that had performed thousands of successful procedures, that had comforted countless patients in hospitals late at night. These same hands had just performed CPR on a stranger at 35,000 feet. These hands had fought against death itself and achieved a draw at best. Derek returned with water, then a blanket, then an ice pack for Marcus's shoulders without being asked. The young man understood what Marcus needed before Marcus understood it himself. "You're a hero," Derek said quietly. "Whatever happens now, whatever the hospital says, you gave him a chance. That's everything." But was it? Marcus drank the water, which hurt his throat going down. His entire body ached, shoulders, back, legs, arms. Every muscle screamed from the intensity of performing CPR. His knees were bruised from kneeling on the cockpit floor. His hands had small cuts and abrasions from contact with Richardson's ribs and equipment. A passenger Marcus hadn't noticed before approached, an older gentleman in a fine suit, someone who looked like he'd been important in his former life. "I want to thank you personally," the man said, extending his hand. "I'm Robert Patterson. I've been a judge for 37 years. I've seen people tested under extreme circumstances. What you did today, that took courage. That took training. That took commitment to something larger than yourself." Marcus shook his hand, uncomfortable with the recognition. He'd simply responded to a situation. He'd done what training demanded. To accept credit felt disingenuous, and yet he understood why these people needed to express gratitude. They needed to believe that in a moment of chaos and terror, someone had stepped forward. They needed to believe that goodness existed in the world. Through the aircraft window, Marcus could see the ambulance in the distance, its lights no longer visible against the brilliant Arizona sunlight. Captain Richardson was in that ambulance, heading toward Phoenix Memorial Trauma Center. A team of cardiologists was already waiting. Surgical teams stood ready. Everything that modern medicine could offer was being mobilized for the captain. But those paramedics, those trained professionals, couldn't perform miracles. They could follow protocols. They could stabilize. They could transport. But whether Richardson lived or died would depend on factors beyond anyone's control. The extent of the damage to his heart, his age and overall health, the exact nature of the cardiac event, whether his brain had suffered hypoxic damage during the arrest. Marcus had done everything he could. From this moment forward, it was beyond his reach. "Doctor, excuse me," another passenger called, a woman in business attire who'd been standing near the restroom during the emergency. "I just wanted to say, my father had a heart attack 5 years ago. If someone hadn't been there for him, I wouldn't have him anymore. What you did, it meant everything to that captain's family, even if you don't know them yet." Marcus nodded, not trusting his voice. How many families were waiting to hear news about Captain Richardson? His wife, obviously, perhaps children, maybe grandchildren, maybe siblings or close friends. All of them were currently in some waiting room in Phoenix, their lives hanging in the balance, dependent on outcomes beyond their control. The flight attendants began moving passengers toward the exits. Law enforcement had boarded, standard procedure for medical emergencies. Representatives from Southwest Airlines were already appearing, distributing information about alternative flights and compensation. The machinery of airline operations continued, indifferent to the human drama that had just unfolded. Tom Chen emerged from the cockpit, his uniform disheveled, his face still bearing the marks of intense stress. He spotted Marcus and walked over immediately. Without a word, he embraced him again, a longer, stronger embrace than before. When he released Marcus, his eyes were wet. "Phoenix Memorial just called the airline," Tom said quietly. "They wanted information about the cardiac event. The paramedics gave them a full briefing. They said your interventions were exactly what needed to happen. They said if you hadn't performed CPR, if you hadn't gotten a pulse before landing, the captain wouldn't have made it off the aircraft alive." Marcus felt something shift inside his chest. Not happiness exactly, but something like relief. Something like the confirmation that his hands, his knowledge, his training had mattered. That in this specific moment, he had made the difference between life and death. "How is he?" Marcus asked. Tom's expression became more complicated. "Critical. They're running tests now. The cardiologist said it was a massive myocardial infarction, one of the worst ones she'd seen in a long time. They're talking about emergency angioplasty, maybe a stent, maybe more depending on what the tests show, but he's alive. He's conscious. He's asking about his crew." Conscious, alive, asking about his crew. Those words meant more to Marcus than any applause or gratitude could. The captain had survived the initial event. The captain had reached the hospital. The captain's brain had apparently not suffered irreversible damage. Whether he would ultimately survive, whether he would recover fully, remained unknown. But right now, in this moment, he was alive and conscious, and that was everything. Marcus sat back in seat 14A, the same seat where he'd started this journey. The aircraft was now being prepped for cleaning and eventual movement to a maintenance hangar. Passengers filed slowly toward the exit, many of them stopping to look at Marcus, to nod, to silently acknowledge what had happened. Outside the window, Phoenix shimmered in the afternoon heat. Somewhere in that city, a trauma team was working to save Captain James Richardson's life. And Marcus, retired Marcus who'd thought his purpose had ended 3 weeks ago, had given them that chance. He closed his eyes, finally allowing exhaustion to claim him, and whispered a prayer for a captain he'd never met but would never forget. 5 days. That was how long Marcus waited before his phone rang. 5 days of staying in Phoenix, longer than planned, longer than he'd anticipated. 5 days of calling the hospital daily, trying to get information he wasn't entitled to receive. 5 days of watching news coverage that reported Captain Richardson's condition in vague, infuriatingly general terms. Stable, undergoing treatment, responding well to intervention. Marcus had spent those 5 days in Daniel's guest room, supposedly relaxing, supposedly enjoying his retirement. Instead, he'd spent the time thinking about Captain Richardson, wondering about his recovery, imagining worst-case scenarios where the cardiac damage was too extensive, where post-operative complications developed, where all of Marcus's efforts simply delayed an inevitable outcome. He'd wanted to visit the hospital, to see Richardson, to know beyond doubt what the outcome of that morning's events had been, but protocol and regulations prevented it. Marcus wasn't family. He wasn't part of the medical team. He was simply a stranger who'd been in the right place at the right time. The phone rang at 2:47 p.m. on Friday afternoon. Marcus was sitting on Daniel's patio, trying unsuccessfully to read his book, when his cell phone vibrated with an incoming call. Unknown number. Phoenix area code. "Hello," Marcus answered, not recognizing the voice. "Is this Marcus Webb?" A woman's voice, warm but uncertain. "Yes, who's calling?" "This is Margaret Richardson, Captain James Richardson's wife." A pause, and Marcus heard her take a breath. "I wanted to thank you personally." Marcus's heart rate elevated immediately. "How is he? How's James?" "Recovering," Margaret said, and her voice broke slightly with emotion. "He's had a rough few days. Emergency angioplasty. They placed 2 stents. The damage to his heart was severe. The cardiologist said another hour without intervention and he wouldn't have made it." Marcus closed his eyes. An hour. If the flight had been longer, if they'd been farther from Phoenix, if any of 1,000 variables had been different, the conversation would have been a very different one. "But he's conscious?" Marcus asked. "Very much so," Margaret said, a hint of smile in her voice now. "And stubborn. He's been asking about the passenger in 14A since he regained consciousness. The flight crew told him your name. I've been tracking down your contact information for 3 days." "How did you?" "Southwest Airlines wasn't very helpful," Margaret continued. "But there's an advantage to being married to a captain for 38 years. People know James. People owed him favors. Eventually, someone provided a description that matched an employee record request from the day of the flight. It took some detective work, but I found you." Marcus didn't know whether to be touched or slightly unsettled by the determination. He settled on touched. "I wanted to hear your voice," Margaret said. "I wanted to thank you for saving my husband's life. I wanted you to know that James is going to be okay." The cardiologist used the word miraculous to describe his recovery trajectory. She said most patients who experience the kind of cardiac event James had don't survive, and if they do, they often suffer significant cognitive or physical impairment. "The CPR was very effective," Marcus said carefully. "The paramedics took excellent care of him, the hospital staff." "Stop," Margaret interrupted gently. "James told me what you did. The flight attendant told me. Tom Chen, the co-pilot, called me personally to describe what happened in that cockpit. You kept my husband alive through sheer force of will and medical skill. You're the reason I still have a husband. You're the reason my children will still have their father." Marcus felt something break inside him, not in a bad way, in the way that dams break, allowing tears to finally flow. He sat quietly on Daniel's patio, unable to speak, unable to process the weight of what Margaret was saying. "He wants to meet you," Margaret continued. "When he's released from the hospital, he wants to thank you in person. He wants to know the man who saved his life." "I'd like that," Marcus finally managed. They talked for another 15 minutes. Margaret told him about James, about his 37-year career, about their 4 children and 6 grandchildren, about his plans to retire after this final trip, about the fact that he'd almost decided to call in sick that morning, about how close they'd come to a completely different ending. When they hung up, Marcus sat for a long time, watching the Arizona sun begin its descent toward the mountains. Somewhere in Phoenix, Captain James Richardson was recovering. His heart was healing. His brain was healing. His will to live, which had clearly been strong even in unconsciousness, was carrying him toward a future Marcus had made possible. That night Marcus called Sarah. His wife answered on the second ring, her voice uncertain. They'd been married for 36 years, but the past 3 weeks had created distance between them. Marcus had been struggling with retirement while Sarah celebrated his freedom from the hospital's relentless demands. He'd been lost while she'd been excited about the possibilities. "Sarah, I'm coming home," Marcus said, "but I need to tell you about what happened on the flight." He recounted the entire story, the subtle signs in Captain Richardson's voice, the emergency, the CPR, the paramedics, Margaret's call. Sarah listened without interrupting, and when he finished, she was quiet for a long moment. "You found your purpose again," she said finally. "What do you mean?" "Exactly what I said. 3 weeks ago you retired and you were lost. You didn't know who you were without the hospital, without the patients, without the responsibility." Sarah's voice was gentle but firm. "But that flight needed you to be exactly who you are. That captain needed your skills. That crew needed your knowledge. Those passengers needed someone to believe that they would survive." "I was just doing what I was trained to do," Marcus said. "Exactly," Sarah agreed. "That's why you're a healer, Marcus. It's not something you stop being just because you leave a hospital. It's who you are. And maybe retirement doesn't mean you stop being that. Maybe it just means you're open to these moments when they arrive." Marcus thought about that. About the cabin full of passengers who would carry this story forward, about Captain Richardson's family, about Tom Chen, who would likely remember that morning for the rest of his flying career, about Derek and the flight attendants who'd assisted without hesitation, about the paramedics who'd taken the patient Marcus had stabilized and carried him toward recovery. He'd done one thing, but that one thing had rippled outward in ways he couldn't have predicted. 2 weeks later, Marcus stood in a Phoenix hospital room, watching Captain James Richardson sit in a chair by the window, looking out at the Arizona landscape. The captain was pale, thinner than he'd been on the flight, but his eyes were alert and aware. He turned when Marcus entered, and a broad smile spread across his face. "Marcus Webb," Richardson said, extending his hand. "The passenger in 14A who became my guardian angel." They talked for 3 hours, about flying and medicine, about careers and purpose, about the moment that had transformed both their lives. Richardson told Marcus that he'd decided not to fly again. The cardiac event had convinced him that it was time to retire and spend time with his family. Marcus told Richardson that he'd decided retirement wasn't an ending, just a different beginning. As Marcus was leaving, Richardson called out to him. "Thank you, Marcus, for everything, for knowing what to do, for refusing to give up, for giving me time with my wife and children." Marcus nodded, unable to speak. He walked out of the hospital into the Arizona sunlight, and for the first time since retiring 3 weeks ago, he felt at peace. His purpose hadn't ended. It had simply transformed. And sometimes transformation was the greatest gift of all.